and colleagues, and welcome to the Bell Hooks Center. Hi, my name is Dr. M, and I'm the director of the Bell Hooks Center at Berea College and chair of Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies. I hope those of you who have not yet taken a class with us will consider doing so in the near future. I am very, very excited to welcome today founder of the Black in Appalachia podcast and Atlanta-based community sociologist, Dr. Enkeshi El-Amin. Dr. El-Amin is currently an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at Agnes Scott College. Her research, exploring the link between race and place, is focused on how racial practices shape Black places and how Black people in turn are involved in practices that define, contest, and reimagine places. Dr. El-Amin is currently working on her first book, based on her dissertation project and under advanced contract with the University of Kentucky Press, about the contested experiences and meanings of urban Black space in a region conventionally represented as a domain of rural white poverty. In today's Gender Talk, Dr. El-Amin shares overlooked narratives of Black women in the central Appalachian coal mining region, challenging prevalent images of Appalachia that exclude Black women's stories. Drawing on primary sources such as oral histories and secondary sources such as the work of Joe Trotter, Karida Brown, and others, she delves into the experiences and contributions of Black women in the development of coal communities from the late 19th to the early 20th century. She highlights the roles that these women played not only within their families, but also in the broader social, economic, and political spheres of their communities. In theory and practice, she calls for a more nuanced understanding of Black Appalachian life. Today's respondent is Berea College's own director of the Carter G. Woodson Center for Interracial Education and associate professor of African and African American Studies and History, Dr. Jessica Clanderud. Dr. Clanderud regularly teaches a course on Black and Indigenous Appalachia and is the author of the recently published Struggle for the Street, Social Networks and the Struggle for Civil Rights in Pittsburgh. Her research focuses on neighborhood street-level dynamics of class and race as African Americans define their own spaces in the 20th century. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge the hard work of my colleagues, namely our student colleagues, of who you met too, Adriel and Fee, and the Bell Hooks Center Program Associate, Kat Moses. Can I get a round of applause? Without these people, none of what we do would be possible. I also want to thank the Loyal Jones Appalachian Center, the Department of African and African American Studies, and the Department of Sociology for their generous co-sponsorship of this event. Without your support, none of what we do would also be possible. The variety of programming we offer would not be. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Enkeshi El-Amin to Berea College. Thank you.
Thank you. Awesome. Thank you all for this invitation. I'm a little bit just taking in this welcome that I've had here at Berea so far. Every person that I've met since I've been on campus have been really helpful and welcoming, and I just feel really loved here. So I really appreciate the welcome. I appreciate so many of you coming out today, and I appreciate this invitation. So first I want to thank you all for the welcome and for the invitation. And I looked at some of the posters that some of the other people that have done this gender talk, and I feel like I'm in good company. So super excited to be here. Like this is, I hope you all can see how excited I am, right? I mean, Belle, what else do you say, right? I feel like when I started doing Black Appalachian Studies years ago, it felt like a new field, even though we've had people doing this work for many years, within the larger mainstream of sociology and even Black studies, we didn't see Black Appalachian studies, right? And so for me as a young scholar at the time, seeing people like Bell Hooks claiming Appalachia, right, really meant something for me as I was, sort of entering into this field. And so, I feel tingles all through my body with excitement to be here, right? I also want to say just Berea in general. I don't know if you all, I know some of you are podcast listeners, but if you haven't, please check out the Black and Appalachia podcast. But this morning I re-listened to our Berea episode because I was like, I want to make sure that I'm up on my Berea things, but it reminded me of how, proud, we are as folks in this region of Berea. And so I'm also happy to be at Berea, because I feel like Berea has been a beacon in this region for many years. I understand that institutions have their troubling histories, but overall, we're very proud of Berea, and so I'm grateful to be here and to be in space with Berea folks. I can go on and on about these things, and I love Q&A, so we can get into some more of this during the Q&A, but I've written something so that I can stay on script because I can wander a bit. So I'm going to read to y'all today. But again, very grateful to be here. And I'm actually going to start with Ed Cabell, who's one of our late and great Black Appalachian Studies scholar. Ed Cabell said years ago that Black Appalachians are a neglected minority within a neglected minority, right? And we know that in the last few years, and let's say last 5 years or so, we've seen some narrative shifts in the region in terms of who is an Appalachian, right? And we've seen more sort of emphasis on bringing out the stories of people of color within this region. But I think the general sentiment that Ed Cabell laid out in that statement is still true, right? But when we add gender, when we add Black women's experiences, the neglect is even more outrageous, right? And so, I think a part of that issue is that so much of Black women's stories and histories have not been documented and organized within the data, right? And so, but based on what we know about race in America, based on what we know about race in Appalachia, which is not as unique as some might suggest, right? We know that Black women in Appalachia face a lot of the issues that Black women across America face, right? We're talking about everything from inadequate childcare, unaffordable housing, other issues related to living at these intersections of race, class, and gender oppressions, right? But in the tradition of sociological approaches grounded in the works of people like W.B. Du Bois and Zora Neale Hurston, I wonder, despite and in spite of these structural issues, what are the nuances, right? What are the day-to-day realities? What are the practices of resistance? What are the placemaking practices? What about religious and organizing practices? Practices of resistance? Placemaking, I said that again, sorry. How have Black women forged community in Appalachian spaces, both historically and in the contemporary period, right? So those are the things that I'm interested in. And I have many questions, many questions. And, my own research has not necessarily focused on Black women's experiences, but I have a lot of curiosity around these questions. And I know that it's going to require a lot of work to answer these types of questions, right? A lot of work that has not been done, a lot of reading in between the lines, a lot of sorting data that has not been organized, a lot of collecting new data because data has not been necessarily collected, a lot of relying on non-traditional sources, and a lot of fresh and new lens and voices, right? So as much as I am here to sort of share snippets of my pursuit of answers, I'm also here hoping to inspire you all as young scholars to answer these questions, to ask these questions and to answer them in your own work, right? So I'm focusing on one specific Appalachian geography. I'm looking at coal communities, and I want to share a little bit about where that interest started for me. So again, as a young graduate student and a budding Black Appalachian Studies scholars, I found an article written by influential African-American educator and reformer Booker T. Washington years ago, right? Again, when I mentioned that finding recognizable people that had Appalachian roots. It really excited me. When I found out that Booker T. Washington had Appalachian roots, I was fascinated by his story, right? In reading Washington's story, the thing that resonated the most to me was when he talked about his mother, right? And the journey that they took from Virginia to West Virginia, out of slavery, to move from Virginia to West Virginia, and they moved into a salt mining and coal mining community, right? So that was something that I was really fascinated by, and I was, again, interested in his mother's story. And that really made me think about other migrating Black women and what were their stories like, and how did they contribute to life in coal communities. So before I get into the context for that, I'm going to give you all just a little bit of overview of the rise of coal communities. I'm going to talk a little bit about the data that I used to answer the questions that I had, and then I'm going to talk about some of the answers that I found. Okay? All right, now I'm going to read for real. I want to try to, at least, to stay on track. Okay, so when it comes to popular representations of Appalachia, few things are as authentic to the region's image as is coal. Beginning with the rise of the industry in the late 19th and early 20th century, coal profoundly transformed the lives and landscapes of central Appalachia. So it makes sense that on the few occasions that people think about Black people in Appalachia, they think of coal miners. Though new and more expansive research is still to be done, Black coal miners, who were primarily men, have been central to inquiries into Black Appalachian life. Typically, when we think about Black people in coal fields, we don't think of the women, the children, and other family formations that were central to coal mining communities. I know that coal mining was a male-dominated occupation and that there had been a decent amount of research on miners' migration processes, their labor experiences, and their political and union activities. Reading Washington's mother's story, however, really made me curious about women's stories in coal communities, particularly coal communities of the late 19th and early to mid 20th century. We know that Black migration to the region started as early as during the Civil War, but really exploded between 1880 and 1930s, right? As more and more Appalachian coal fields opened, coal companies aggressively recruited Black workers. Black people came from nearby states of Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, and later farther south locations like Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, right? Just to give you a snapshot of this migration, let's look at numbers from southern West Virginia, which is where, again, Washington's family was moving to. The Black population in West Virginia increased from 25,800 in 1880 to over 64,000 in 1910 and nearly 115,000 in 1930, right? Huge increases. Black men represented about 20% of the coal mining population, contributing to the spike in coal production in the southern counties of West Virginia from 5 million tons in 1885 to almost 40 million tons in 1910 and to 120 tons in 1925, right? Major impact on the region and on coal producing. While early migration into coal fields was dominated by men, as they were more likely to go ahead of their families or migrate as young single men, over time the sex ratio evened out. In 1920 in West Virginia, for example, there were 125 men to 100 women, right? So pretty fairly the numbers. Black women might have taken the journey later, but their movement into coal towns of Appalachia was significant. And I wanted to know the stories of these migrating women and about life in coal towns. I wanted to know how did their actions, motivations, and desires in these communities contributed to the survival of their communities. So to answer our question, I pulled from primary as well as secondary sources for data, primary being first-hand accounts and secondary being secondhand information and commentary by scholars, researchers. Several years ago, our Black in Appalachia team, as many of you all might know, I'm a part of Black in Appalachia team. And several years ago, William Isom over there, collected oral histories with people from from Eastern Kentucky, the Eastern Kentucky Social Club. And so these were children of people who migrated to the region. Many of them moved with their families as children. Some of them were born in the region, right? So they were able to talk about their family stories. And in talking about their family stories, they talked about their mothers, right? So, which was great for me because I didn't have to go do that research myself. So I was able to pull from some of those oral histories, as well as memoirs written by people like Memphis, Tennessee Garrison, who some of you might know of, and sociologist Bill Turner, who I know has Berea roots as well. I also use secondary sources, people like Joe Trotter, who I know some people are familiar with, and Karida Brown, who also has Eastern Kentucky roots, right? So these were people that I was able to pull from the research that they had done already to answer some of these questions that I had. So in sorting these data, the themes that emerged suggested to me that Black women were not just passive subjects in coal camps. They played a crucial role in the migration process, contributed to their families' economic survival, and were vital to community and political activities in coal communities. In what follows, I'll offer how their actions, motivations, and desires contributed to the survival of their communities, and I'll emphasize the migration process and the economic contribution. For the sake of time, maybe during Q&A we can talk about some of their social and political work in communities as well. All right, so let's talk about the migration process. I'm going to drink some water as well. Okay. So Black women might have taken the journey later, but their movement into the coal towns of Appalachia was driven by their own desires to escape rural and urban poverty, racist terrorism, and to hold their families together, to afford freedoms to their children, and generally control their own lives and destinies. In their originating communities, many of the Black women who would migrate to coal communities labored on farms alongside the men in their family. They cultivated crops for their family's consumption as well as to be sold. Some were sharecroppers, and they did domestic tasks. Moreover, men were able to seek work in Appalachian coal towns because women would stay behind and take care of the children. This primary caretaking role would last for weeks, sometimes months, or even years under circumstances of rural poverty again, right? After they were able to secure employment and housing and or to save enough money for families' travel, some husbands would return for their wives and children. And so, as I said earlier, most of my research is in Black Knoxville. So I study urban Appalachia. And I was able to find in my own work in the bottom, which was a neighborhood that was destroyed by urban renewal in Knoxville, it was a predominantly Black neighborhood. I was able to find evidence of fathers who couldn't find work in their local economies moving to Eastern Kentucky to work and leaving mothers behind, right? So I think of one person in particular, his wife was sick. And so they couldn't make that trip together. So she stayed behind, had chronic illness. In the memoir that I read, it didn't say exactly what was wrong with her, but that she was always sick, right? But she was left to take care of the family's 5 children while dad went to Eastern Kentucky to work in coal towns. He didn't stay there. They didn't live there forever, but he would go for months at a time and return home, right? So for some women, holding down the family is what holding down the family is what allowed men to go do the work, and sometimes came back, sometimes the entire family moved. Other women made the journey by themselves with their children. So sometimes fathers would come back for families, sometimes women would make the journey on their own, right? So that was the case of Booker T. Washington's family, right? So his stepfather migrated first, and then his mother came along with the children after the war had ended. His father migrated during the Civil War. Let's see. And Booker T. Washington described that journey as a rather tedious and in some cases painful undertaking. And reading more about his family, I learned that his mother was also sick. And so she couldn't take the journey with the children without some sort of help. And so the stepfather sent money back to get a wagon so that they can load up their things and then travel hundreds of miles across a mountain to West Virginia. I could not imagine doing that at all. Right? So again, the strength of these women, right? And here's a quote from him that I thought really captured what that journey might have been like. We were several weeks making the trip, and most of the time we slept in the open air and did our cooking over log fires in the outdoors. One night I recall that we camped near an abandoned log cabin, and my mother decided to build a fire in that for cooking, and afterwards to make a pallet on the floor for our sleeping. Just as the fire had gotten well started, a large black snake, fully a yard and a half long, dropped down the chimney and ran out onto the floor. Of course, I know, we at once abandoned that cabin, right? Again, I couldn't imagine that experience, right? So not only making this journey by foot, over several weeks, but also this real interactions with the natural world. Nothing that I want a part of, right? Again, to me, that speaks to the strength of these women. And again, journeys happened in different ways, but for some people, that was the reality, right? Now, Washington's mother had been enslaved up until this point, so I can imagine that, this opportunity to not only, something for herself, but for her family meant the world, right? And so that was an active decision that she was making. And though she likely didn't know it at the time, the decision to make this very difficult journey contributed to the future for her son that was drastically different from her own. And this was something that I believe that many of the women who made this migration had to have contemplated, right? Labor recruiters was another means that Black people migrated into coal communities in Appalachia, right? Dr. Karida Brown talks about this person, the way she talked about it, you got a sense that it was a character who wore this big straw hat, right? And we have on the Black and Appalachia website, if you get a chance to check it out, you can see an interview with her where she's talking about Limehouse. And he was a white man that would move goods and men to eastern Kentucky, right? And sometimes the journey, so sometimes he would move the men and they would work off their debt, the cost of transporting them, and then they would work until they could make enough money to pay him to go bring their families, right? And so sometimes the trip was just women and children, right? So one of the people that Dr. Brown spoke with, as well as one of the people that we interviewed through Black in Appalachia, was Gene Austin, and here's what he had to say about the trip with Limehouse. And one day he came by. I guess my mother knew him, and we left and came up here. He would pick people up that wanted to get out of Alabama, but the car that we came up here in, he wasn't bringing no men. He wasn't bringing no men to work. He just had some women, wives of the men who he had already brought, and their kids. There were just some women and kids. There was 3 women: my mother, Miss Baskin, and another lady and her kid. Right? So some of these women did the journey on their own, trusting this man that had brought their husbands prior. And then you had women who just kind of single women who came to coal communities, right? So one of the people that we talked with, and I had a video, but one of the people that we talked with during those interviews talked about his mother and her situation being a little bit different because she came from Louisiana, right? That was not necessarily a place where we saw this migration here. But she came from Louisiana, and she came as a single woman to help to take care of some relatives that were already there. And while she was in Benham, she met her husband, and they got married and had children, right? So some women came as single women as well. But what I think is really interesting here, what Brown points out, is that women who accompanied their husbands to coal camps were in some way sacrificing their own freedom for life as coal miners' wives. Oh my God, 10 minutes. Okay. And we know that birth control wasn't necessarily something that was readily available to these women. So you were ultimately sort of in this to win it, right? Like you were there sometimes with as many as 16, 17 children, right? All right, let me make sure I get back to it. 10 minutes. All right. But again, these women were making an active decision to take this journey and to make the sacrifice, right? To offer their children new starts, clean opportunities, and freedoms that they didn't necessarily have for themselves, right? Jerome Ratchford, who I mentioned earlier, points out that our parents didn't want us to have what they did, right? So they would say to us, get your education, and that's what your job is. because I want you to have the opportunities that I didn't. And when we look at these videos, again, with these people talking about growing up in these co-communities, they were so proud to be from these communities, and they talked about all of the great things that they would go on to do, right? So-and-so got a PhD, so-and-so's daughter became a judge, all of these different things, and they credited their success to their parents, right? But fathers worked long hours in coal mines. So mothers were the ones who were responsible for this sort of emotional labor and this encouraging their children and sort of pushing them, and oftentimes pushing them out of the coal community so that they can go and do big things in the world, right? So again, that's not something that they didn't necessarily sit down to talk to us about their mothers, but these stories sort of came out, right? This is part of their reading in between the lines that you'll have to do sometimes to do research in these communities, right? I know I probably only have 5 minutes left, but I want to talk a little bit about some of the work that women did in the communities once they migrated, right? Upon their arrival in coal towns, Black women were certainly limited in terms of opportunities for employment. Nevertheless, they contributed economically to their households through their domestic tasks as well as through employment in a select few fields, right? According to Trotter in 1920, 19.8% of Black women in West Virginia were gainfully employed. This was significantly larger than the other women in the state, right, including white women and women who were European migrants. Professions like teaching, domestic work, and later nursing allowed Black women entry into formal labor force. Domestic work, however, seemed the most readily available. And one of the people that Trotter interviewed, Miss Margaret Moorman, here's what she said about domestic work. She said, no matter how poor white people are, they can always find a little change to hire a Black woman in their home. And my mother did that. She would work occasionally for some of the bosses, right? So domestic work was a lot of the work that these women did, right? Memphis, Tennessee Garrison, who you might know of, she was a civil rights leader in her community. She was a teacher for over almost 50 years, but her mother was a laundress. And I want to read what she said about her mom. My mom was a worker. She had a hand laundry. She would wash all day for 50 cents. And she worked for rich people who had to find things. There were no laundries. There were no dry cleaning then. And she always had a good job with the rich people. Out here in West Virginia, she worked for the coal operators. When she wasn't housekeeping with them, she was nursing with the children in the yard, or she was doing laundry. After she did their work, she would work in the small hotels or boarding houses. When she'd leave there, she'd meet the laundry at home. She'd wash and iron half of the night, right? So again, this domestic work helped to supplement incomes of fathers who might have worked in coal towns. And Memphis, Tennessee Garrison's mom, her dad died early, so her mom raised her and her brother. And through this laundry working, her mother was also an activist in the church and in her local community. But through this work, she was able to educate her child. She's paid for Garrison to go to college, right? So as a laundry woman, she was able to make sure that her child had a college education. And a lot of the people that we talked with also talked about how their mothers made sure or encouraged them to go to college, right? Let's see. How are we doing on time? Oh, 5 more minutes. All right, we can do it. All right. So here's another example. Dorothy Morrow was a nurse in the coal town of Benham, Kentucky. After college at Tuskegee in Alabama, again, Tuskegee was founded by Booker T. Washington. So the sacrifice that his mother made for him had a ripple effect, right? So she went to college at Tuskegee and returned. She said, this is the reason she gave for returning. I had a desire to come back to the mountains. Because far as I knew, at the time, there were no Black nurses working in Eastern Kentucky as registered nurses. And the second reason is because I was a mountain girl, right? So she went, got educated as a nurse, and came back and worked in her community. Women in coal communities also use domestic skills and informal training to earn income, doing work such as sewing, cooking, hairdressing, and running boarding houses. Trotter tells the story of Mary Davis, whose husband got seriously injured in a mine accident, and in the 1920s, and to ensure her family's survival, in addition to caring for her disabled husband and raising 18 children, y'all, can't imagine. She started a business, right? So during the 1920s and 30s, she ran a restaurant and boarding house that not only helped her family financially, but was also a service to families of unemployed coal miners, right? So again, this is an economic enterprise for her own family, but she's also thinking about the benefits of the larger community, right? So it's sort of mutual aid work that we see sort of re-emerging today. Folks been doing it in communities, right? I want to give a quote from Dr. Bill Turner, who talks about his mom and what the ways that she was enterprising, right? He said that um, the clusters of women who he spoke of the clusters of women who frequented Mama's kitchen. The space was hospitable and gossipy, especially on Fridays and Saturday nights when Mama, an enterprising though bootlegging hairdresser, did hair for 75 cents a head while simultaneously hosting bidwits card parties, right? So she was getting her coins, but also having entertainment for these communities, right? Again, small coal mining communities, you do what you do to create community, to entertain yourselves, etc. Black women in coal towns also contributed to families' economic well-being. This is my last paragraph. By gardening, right? This I think is really important and we don't talk about enough, right? But just about everybody, Trotter in his book wrote about all these women that had gardening plots, right? And again, we're talking about people who coming from rural South, they knew how to farm, right? And so these gardening plots helped in times of work shortages, in times of strikes, right? And people were able to feed themselves, their families, and even people around them, right? People also did canning to preserve food so that in later time when things were hard, they had food to eat. And again, did things like sewing the family's clothes, right? I talked to a lot of elders and they always talked about how their parents, their moms and their grandmothers sewed the clothes that they wore, right? Using things like flour sacks, right? Whatever you can find, making curtains and clothes out of whatever you can find and get your hands on, right? So I think, again, it's really important for me to tell these stories, again, to bring, these weren't necessarily stories that these people who were talking were deliberately talking about, but I felt like these are stories that need to be brought to the forefront for us to think about and to start to scratch and unlayer the ways that Black Appalachian women have been central to Black Appalachian communities, right? And again, my goal here is to inspire you all as young scholars to do some digging, right? And to tell these stories. And it doesn't have to be done in a thesis or a dissertation. It could be for a class project. I didn't do any of this research myself in terms of the interviews, but I was able to pull from what other people have written and to bring these stories to the forefront. And so I want to, again, charge y'all with digging into the Appalachian communities right where you are and tell the stories of Black women because there's so many more stories. People are doing research on all sorts of things, but Black Appalachian studies is it's a young rather and growing field, and there's so much potential for exciting research. And so if anything stands out to you, find the questions, follow your curiosity, and answer the questions. Okay? That's all I'll add, and I'll stop. Thank you. Whew. Fast.
I did.
Thank you. Thank you. Possibly, yes.
Hello,
Yes.
everyone.
That's it.
All right, check and make sure it's awake. Hello. All right, thank you so much, Dr. El-Amin.
Yes.
It is a privilege to get to stand here and talk a bit about the role of Black Appalachian women, especially in tin making. This idea that I think, it's important that we talk about Black women's work, but the work is more than just what gets the wage. And I think that often when we talk about Black women and work, we talk about this idea that, Black women have been in the workforce, the idea that, women entered the workforce after World War II. I'm like, make sure you say white women because Black women have been in the workforce the whole time. But this idea of kin making, of making relationships, of building community, and that happened in Black women's kitchens. And I think that this kind of conversation about the coal communities and the way that Black women created the idea of home. They created the idea of community. And when we get to the period of time called the Great Migration by some, and by Dr. Karida Brown, sometimes called the Great Escape, I think it's important that we talk about what that means, because it wasn't just about building home and community in the coal camps. It was about what happened when you had to flee. What happened when you had to move your family from Alabama or Mississippi and you ended up in Eastern Kentucky and you had to rebuild your community. You had to rebuild your connections to other people. You had to rebuild what it meant to be family in some cases, because it was not the same as the place that you had come from. And then I think as we kind of proceed further in time, for those that had to leave for a variety of reasons, they left Appalachia, but they took it with them. And so what does that mean? What does it mean to be Black and Appalachian in Detroit? These are some questions that I think we have some work to do around figuring out what those things mean and how we can read between the lines and get a sense of what it was like to be sitting in a Black woman's kitchen in Benham, Kentucky, playing bid whiz, because that absolutely happened. And for the rest of you that don't know, so there's all the conversation about Black people and playing spades. Bid whiz is also like spades in a way, in terms of it's a regional card game, and there are people that are fiercely dedicated to bid whiz. It's fun. But I think that these questions help us get a stronger sense of what it really meant to be a part of this great migration. And I'm really curious myself, and my current research is looking into not only how Black women built communities and built relationships and built these kin networks in their kitchens, but also to what degree was this great migration an escape? To what degree was it a refugee crisis? Were we looking at, because when we look at the time period when Black people were moving out of the South, that's also the height of when the Klan is developing, y'all. So I think there's some questions there that we need to answer. And women's role in this whole process is absolutely critical. And there's one other piece that I don't think we've looked at kind of enough, and it's interesting because it's not the first place you would think of to go. The coal companies themselves were looking to women because they were like, these men are crazy if left to their own devices.
Absolutely.
We want women to come so they will settle them down, and then they'll have responsibilities and children and things they have to manage. So in some ways, these recruiters were bringing the wives of men. In some ways, they were bringing single women with the hope, like, this will settle them down. They won't be so crazy. But the coal companies themselves were invested in making sure that women made it to these coal camps because they wanted it to be a family-friendly environment. And that in itself is kind of a fascinating story too. So there's so many things to dig in here. I appreciate, again, Dr. El-Amin, the call for more work. We need this research to happen. And we are still at a place where the generation of people following the kind of height of the coal camps are still with us. So we can get these oral histories and these interviews with the people that were children in the coal camps. And if you're following the development of historical study right now, questions about women, questions about children, these are kind of many of the things that are at the forefront of our understanding of work and labor right now. And so I just very much appreciate this reminder to think about the role of women broadly in building community and building home and creating place. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. We're going to open it to Q&A for both our respondents and speakers. We have some time, so to ask your question.
Oh, sure.
So at Berea College, we've been having a lot of conversations about what is essentially at other schools like a work-study program, what we call a labor program.
Mm-hmm.
And there's been pushes to change the name from a labor program to something like work-study or something else that signals respectability, politics, and professional upward mobility.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of us have said, wait. The word labor has a whole history.
Absolutely.
Labor movement, and we are founded on a great commitment that supports the dignity of all labor. And so how might we have conversations about this, thinking about space and place and being in Appalachia regionally?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Great question. And yeah, I don't think that we need to shy away from labor, especially in this region, right? So much of our understanding of what Appalachia is connected to labor. So much of what is needed to move Appalachia to the next next stages requires labor, right? I was talking to students earlier about the podcast making and the amount of labor that it requires to produce a podcast. And so I agree that I agree with pushing back on it, right? I mean, I think that respectability. I mean, we know that respectability doesn't serve us, right? Things are constructed for purposes of oftentimes people in power, right? And so we have to ask questions about why all the time, right? Why do we want to change this? What does it mean about who we are, who we're suggesting that we are? I think absolutely. We talk about, again, it started with coal mining because when people think about Appalachia, they think about coal, right? And it was very laborious, right? Like it was very labor intensive work. And it was transforming our geography, to our topography, right? Even before that, right? Like you think about slavery, people don't like to connect slavery to this region, but labor was necessary for us to live in these mountains, right? And so, and I think, again, when I mentioned about Berea and when I re-listened to that episode earlier, Berea was a place that we were proud of as Appalachians, right? Because Berea was trying to do something different, right? Berea was actually trying to live up to the exceptionalism that Appalachia claims to be, right? And so I think that this is no place for people to shy away from what Appalachia is and who Appalachians are, right? But rather to champion all of what makes us who we are, and all the people and all of the work that was and is still necessary for life in this region. Yeah. Other questions? Now, I know Berea students are brilliant. I've had the pleasure of working with some through Black and Appalachia, so I want to hear from the brilliant students as well.
Yes. Aww. Here's your tiny microphone. That's for the recording.
Hi, I love your talk. My name is Ellie. To pan off the labor question, I love to work with a bunch of students when it comes to activism projects, and specifically something that we're doing currently and working to get a labor union formed at Berea College for our student workers, as we are student workers.
Yes.
And a lot of the commentary that we hear is we already have gotten enough, that we've already fought hard enough, that we're at a breaking point. As an activist yourself, do you think there's ever a stop for activism? Do you think you've ever reached an end?
I wish. I wish. Activism is a word that, for me, I dabble on the margins of activism. I'm an academic and an entrepreneur at heart, but because of the work I do, I'm pulled into organizing and activism spaces. But also, I think that there's room for activism within scholarship, right? So scholar activism. So I'll take it. But yeah, I wish the work ended. I wish we got to a place where we stopped, right? When I talk to elders who've been on the ground since the 70s or before, they laugh at me when I when I say the things that when I say I'm tired, for example, right? Like, what are you tired of? You just started the other day, right? But being tired is real, and we need to tap out sometimes and rest and tap back in. But absolutely, if we're saying that if this is labor, then a labor movement seems appropriate, right? Like a union seems appropriate, right? Because as workers, we have rights, or we should have rights, and if we don't demand them, we know we don't get them, right? And again, we are proud of Berea, but also Berea needs to be held accountable as well, right? Even our institutions that we love, we have to hold them accountable. Sometimes if we don't do that, nothing happens, right? So absolutely, please organize, and please tap into the resources and the histories in this region of organizing, right? Because there's plenty to pull from, and there's plenty of people in communities willing to help you all. So absolutely, tap in and do the work. Yeah. These are the best years to do the work, because when you get older and you have a family, you're tired, right? But the work continues. Yeah. What else?
Where are we? Here's your tiny microphone.
Thank you. I have a lot of voice, so thank you. Arts and crafts, music are such an important and well-known part of Appalachia. How much do you have find out Black people, Black women have to do with this culture? For example, quilting, or the food and the bluegrass music that is
Yeah.
associated with this region.
A lot of times when we think of Appalachia, we think of folkways, what people call folkways, but it's our craft cultures. And really, we don't see Black folks highlighted in that light, right? But again, the work that we do is it's so intimate to us, right? It's what we do to survive. Again, to building homes, creating community, right? And so it's just what we do, right? We don't always give it a name, right? But again, I was talking to elders 2 weeks ago, and one person was telling me about um, uh, her grandmother sewing from those flour sacks, right? Like, blew my mind. I mean, these things in reality, but like to hear them talk about these stories, and oftentimes people are not asking them those stories, right? Because the value is not placed on that. The value is placed on something else. But this is a part of what was necessary, right? It was part of life. This is how we did, and it wasn't this thing or that thing. People probably didn't make a big fuss about it, right? You need a quilt because it's cold, right? So you sew it, right? You need clothes, so you sew it, right? You couldn't afford necessarily to buy what was in the store, or maybe you bought what in the store sometimes of the year, but the day to day you sewed it, or you made what you needed. Like she talked about making the window curtains, right? So people did what they needed. Even the music, right? It's part of how you survive in the space. Music is sort of the thing that's in our souls, and it comes out when we're working or when we're doing other things. So, and these traditions go back in Appalachia, right? There are people who do this research, and we can trace the roots of things like the banjo, which we all know about, but other forms of music, right? And connecting Appalachian music, what is Appalachian music, to Black music in general, right? These traditions have always been in our community, and that's why I said, like, the gardening is something that is really exciting and important to me, because we don't think of the gardening as the way that we think of crafting, right? But it requires a lot of effort and creativity to grow, right? And to make, not just grow for food, but to grow for prettiness, to beautify your area, right? Because we deserve pretty things, and we like to look at pretty things, right? So absolutely. And again, I think that more of those stories can come out. When you sit down, we think about something like fish fries, right? We worked with a student a couple of years ago, documenting fish fries in the community, because, again, a necessary thing because we need to fundraise. But then there's a craft and there's an art in that, and there's a folk way in that is important to sustaining our communities. Even the same student worked on funeral songs, right? Something that we don't think about as folk tradition, but it's so important to our communities. It's just what we do, right? There's plenty, and again, that's why I want to encourage you, young scholars, to really dig and to think about not always the things that get all the shine, but also the little things, right? When you sit and talk to your grandmother, and your grandfather and other people in your family, the little things that you get, those are nuggets, and those are important nuggets, right? And when you're doing history and you're doing this sort of work, these are the pieces that helps us to tell stories that were excluded from official documentation, right? A lot of times Black communities were not in the archives. So we have to pull on these narratives and these stories to think about and see what life was like, not just for the sake of what life was like, even though that's important, but also so we can get insights on how to live in the future, right? Like, Nikki Giovanni always says that if you want to know how to live in Mars, talk to Black folks, right? Because we've had to live in impossible circumstances, right? So those stories are important if we're going to see ourselves in the future, right? So absolutely. What else?
I want to just piggyback off of that a little bit because in my research on another urban Appalachian context in Pittsburgh, this didn't make it into the book, but I found lots of information about the creation of a whole set of laws meant to criminalize urban farming. And where these things kind of came back was, in the 20 teens, you have a bunch of hipsters moving into the central downtown areas, and they're like, we're going to create this great urban farm. And then they found out that it was basically against the law. And when you look at when those laws were put into place, they were put in during the Great Migration because lots of Black folks from the South were moving to these urban areas, and they were trying to prevent them from having gardens in the city, because this was the way that they took care of their family, is we make sure we have, a little plot of land. We're going to put some pots out, put some tomatoes and collard greens in them, and just like whatever.
Right.
And, now then all these years later, folks are running up against these laws that were meant to criminalize what the Black community was doing for survival. Absolutely. So it's really interesting that, you can look at what amounts to a pretty dry set of reading for historical sources, legal statutes, right? But then when you start comparing it against what's going on in the Black community, and you're like, hold up a minute.
Absolutely.
And they did not stutter about saying who they were trying to criminalize with these new sets of laws. So gardening is definitely on there. I also think too, and I just got back from the student civil rights tour with a bunch of students, and one of the conversations we were having on the bus was about funerals. And we were talking with a number of our African international students, and we were talking about like, okay, do you go to the funeral for the food? And everyone's like, yeah, of course you go to the funeral for the food. Like, I don't know if you know the person or not, but you definitely go and you say your condolences and you get the food. And then you're like, now the question is, do you take a plate home from the funeral? And all of the African students and all of the African American students were like, absolutely, you take a plate of food home. This is how you care for your community. And a number of the white students were like, I don't know if that's okay. And we're like, no, it's fine. You take a plate home from the funeral. So we were talking about how these are some of the carryovers that we see of African traditions in the African American community that have survived enslavement and other things. That, you don't always think of some of these traditions being carried that way, but the women are the carriers of tradition by and large. So that's just a quick note of affirmation to your point there.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's precious.
Hello.
Hey.
Okay. Well, okay. So my question is kind of like this narrative of Appalachia is seen mostly, and from a lot of Black communities, Appalachia is seen only as a white culture, and therefore we don't really see ourselves a lot. And so my question is, like, how do we start that conversation in the Black communities and expressing that Appalachian culture and saying that we are the for also part of the forerunners in creating that kind of culture in Appalachia, but also creating that conversation between the elders and also the youth at the same time within the same room, the same space, creating that conversation among both. So.
Yeah, great question. Hard work. One of the things that, for me, that I've been most proud of the work that we do at Black in Appalachia, and Black in Appalachia, the organization, there are a lot of people involved in the work that we do. A lot of people adding different components, right? So you might see a few faces, but there are a lot of people involved in the work. And one of the things that makes me the most proud of all of the work that we do is the ways that we've been shifting narratives for Black folks in this region so that they can feel, if they choose, to be a part of what Appalachia is, right? And the reason I said if they choose is because, again, place and space is contested, right? And people have different ideas about, and they're entitled to have those ideas about what space is. But what we try to do is to lay out the facts as we know it, right? And when you have those facts, you can make the decision to do whatever it is that you want to do, right? So since our podcast, for example, I've seen, at least in the context of Knoxville, I've seen Black people identify with Appalachia, right? Well, I remember when I started doing my research, and I was meeting with elders, I've had folks say things like, they wanted to apply for a grant to build a healthcare facility in the Black community in Knoxville, and they said, and this doctor was saying, well, connect it to Appalachia because, we might get some more money. And they said, if you put Appalachia on it, they're going to send the money up there, right? Not in Knoxville, right? But then the same person would tell me that I'm a hillbilly, right? This is somebody in his 80s, and he was saying, I'm a hillbilly, right? And so you have these Appalachian sensibilities that what I call them, right? There's knowledge of the mountains. There's knowledge of this region, right? There are things that, when we think of what is Appalachia, that they're familiar with and connect with, but the term, right? Appalachia is where we see this sort of disconnect, right? And so because of keep saying, we say loud enough, people start to say, oh yeah, that's me, right? And I'm proud to wear that t-shirt, right? Or they see our t-shirts out and about and like, oh, I like that. It's like permission to say that I'm connected to this space. And I wasn't born in this region, but this space has welcomed me and taken me in, and I claim it, right? But I think as far as the conversations, we have to create space for them, right? You have to create space for them, right? In your community, right? You can bring your elders and your people in your generation together to create that space, to have the conversations. And it doesn't necessarily have to be around what is Appalachia. It could be whatever to that community. And you make the connections, and you give them the images, and you give them the bits and pieces, right? I have elders who listen to the Black and Appalachia podcast, right, that I know. And a lot of times they're our biggest audiences, right? So it will require some work. That labor, again, is important, right? But it is possible, and it does give you a good feeling when you see the changes, when you see the shifts, when you see young people and old people claiming to be Black Appalachians.
Thank you so much, Dr. El-Amin. I want to remind all of you that our center's namesake, Bell Hooks, was not an affiliated professor with women's and gender studies during her time in Berea. She was a distinguished professor in Appalachian studies. And so Berea has a long history, and we can continue to work on uplifting that history of Black folk in Appalachia. Please join me in thanking Dr. Enkeshi El-Amin and our respondent, Dr. Jessica Clanderud.